Hello everyone. So today we're going to look at volcanoes at plate boundaries. So in your Edmodo, go to the post that says volcanoes at plate boundaries. We have the link for the reading. We have our practice questions. And we have my email that you can send your answers to. So let's take a look at volcanoes at plate boundaries. So we can have them at convergent plate boundaries. So remember, converging plate boundaries, you can have two oceanic plates, two continental plates, or one of each. If at least one of those plates is oceanic, it is going to subduct, which means it's basically going under the crust, plunging into the mantle. A subducting plate is going to make volcanoes. And a lot of the world's volcanoes are the result of subduction. So melting, mantle melting, which is one way that volcanoes form. So mantle melting can happen in three ways. So it can happen if temperature rises. It can happen if pressure lowers, which lowers the melting point of the mantle material. It can happen if water is added, which also lowers the melting point. So in cases 1 and 3, temperature rising, water being added, these might explain why there are volcanoes at convergent plate boundaries. Because one of the plates is oceanic, so it's already in the water, and the temperature of the subducting plate is going to increase. Okay? And then the sediments that are on top of the subducting plate are going to contain water. So we have temperature rising and we have our melting point lowering. So as the sediments subduct, the water is going to rise into the overlying mantle material, lowering its melting point. And then when this mantle material melts, volcanoes are going to form above it. So the Pacific Rim, there are a lot of convergent plate boundaries in the Pacific Ocean Basin. Remember, around that area called the Pacific Ring of Fire. And oceanic trenches are places where we have subduction zones. All right, and volcanoes are going to be found at these subduction zones. One example of a volcano like this are the Cascades. So the Cascades are a chain of volcanoes at a convergent boundary where oceanic plate is subducting beneath a continental plate. All right, Cascades have been active for a long time, but the mountains that are visible, those are ones, you know, they're not as old as the actual mountains themselves. All right, because it takes time for mountains to build up. Divergent plate boundaries. So at divergent plate boundaries, what happens is the plates are moving apart. So now the hot mantle rock is going to rise into the space where these plates are moving apart. As it rises, the pressure on it is going to decrease, because when it's in the mantle, it has more rocks above it, putting more pressure on it. As it gets to the surface, it does not have those rocks above it anymore, so it's at lower pressure. So lower pressure, remember, this is going to lower the melting point of the rock. So this is why we have volcanoes at divergent plate boundaries. And the lava is going to go through the long cracks in the ground called fissures. Mid-ocean ridges. Mid-ocean ridges they happen at divergent plate boundaries where it's ocean plate and ocean plate. But this is because there's seafloor spreading, and seafloor spreading is going to create new seafloor in the rift valleys. So this type of volcanism is going to be what makes up the ocean floor. And then hotspots, which we'll talk about more in depth in the future, are where you can get volcanoes that create islands. So volcanoes that creates islands, there are some in Iceland. And then like there's a hotspot along the ridge at Iceland, and then the Hawaiian Islands are a result of a hotspot. So another divergent plate boundary where we find eruptions and volcanoes are when we have continental rifting. So remember, this is two continental plates spreading apart. All right, an example of this is Mount Gahinga. These are in the East African Rift Valley. Well, the East African Rift between the African and Arabian plates. All right, so a lot of information, but make sure you finish your questions and turn them into me.